everyone. Welcome to week 4. This week we're going to be talking about individual differences in second language acquisition. So before I begin, I just wanted to thank you all for your hard work with the discussion boards, and everything has been so awesome to read, and you guys are really engaging with each other, and I really appreciate it. So thank you very, very much. This week, we're going to be talking about some of the major points from the Lightbound and Spotted textbook, and then we'll kind of pivot to the other readings for our discussion this week and talk about the topics of age and motivation as variables and SLA. So let me begin. There are a ton of factors that have been thought to correlate with one's ability to learn a second language. And these have all been empirically studied in a number of studies in SLA, and our textbook provides. And so you can read a bunch of examples in each of these categories. So first of all, let's dive into general intelligence. So I think this is something that, you can consider as your old school traditional IQ tests. But then there's some ideas of language aptitude, and this is something that we'll talk about in a couple more slides. But basically, what are the specific types of strategies that we learn when we use the specific types of strategies that we use when learning a second language? So do you break down the grammar by like a mnemonic, or do you memorize vocabulary using flashcards, stuff like that? Next is motivation, which is another super important factor that's been widely studied, as you might imagine. So as you read, there's a lot of different types of motivation to learning a new language. You could talk about, your motivation to get a job overseas, or your motivation to have, more skills under your belt, or you are marrying into a family that has another language in it. There's tons of motivations. So the next one that is related to motivation is also this idea of learners' beliefs and attitudes about learning a language in general. So how does the learner think that the language is going to be learned, and what are their ideas about the culture that this language represents? That's a really fascinating one, and this is related to the ideological. So belief and ideology are synonyms here. So if you see the word ideology, think belief. The next one is age. We're not going to talk too much about this because I want to kind of pivot to the discussion board. A lot of you have posed questions about age already in the discussion forum, so I think this will be a really fun activity for us to engage with together. Age has obviously been investigated quite widely, and we're reading a critique of age-based studies in SLA this week in the Maranova-Todd et al. Reading. I think I'll stop there so we can kind of, I'm just previewing that phenomenon. Next, I wonder what you might think about the personality variable that has been studied. Do you think maybe being an introvert or an extrovert influences your ability to pick up another language? So, some of the things that we've talked about in the discussion are whether you need some social input or, a personal connection to the second language that you're learning. But does your personality as being an introvert help or hinder your ability to learn a second language? I think these are all fascinating questions. And then next, let's think about your identity. Okay, so does identity or social affiliation, does this impact how much you are motivated, or how much, because these are all related, right? These are all interwoven. So does your identity or social affiliation impact how you're going to acquire a second language? These are all very, very cool. So under this social affiliation or potentially ethnic affiliation, this might be in the same kind of vein as studying about heritage learners. So people who learn a language at home, but not necessarily in a more pedagogically rigid, i.e. school scenario. So this is that question. And as you can tell, As you can tell, I don't have answers to this. This is just me posing a lot of questions. So empirical studies will examine the correlation between these factors and students' abilities in their second language, not causation, right? So there might be variables working behind the scenes, so confounding variables when you find these correlations, or they might work in tandem, so if you find a study of people studying Spanish and they have super positive attitudes about Spanish, you might conclude that, well, you'll have better aptitude and proficiency if you have a better attitude and a higher ideological perspective on the language itself. But it might just be that there are certain students in the class that are doing well and getting good grades, and so they're happier about coming to class. Does that make sense? The other thing that we can't really talk to, we can, what's the phrase? Like, you can never talk too much about, I always want to bring up the concept of socioeconomic status and access to resources. So people who have more resources may be more or less potentially motivated to utilize those resources in different ways. So these are all things to think about, as it's important to remember that there's no causative relationship here. It's more correlative, correlation, not causation. Okay. Continuing on. So I just said this. Okay. Let me just my notes. All right. Okay. So there's a ton of research in applied linguistics about research methods and all these things, and making sure that when you're studying correlation between aptitude or proficiency and SLA, that you're actually studying the quote unquote right variables. But some of the more significant findings that have come out in the past several decades relate specifically to the topic of general intelligence. Fred Genese found in his study back in the 70s, for example, that there was a positive correlation between intelligence and certain aspects of language ability, specifically those that are related to classroom learning. So the ability to memorize vocab, the ability to read in the second language, ability to understand and use grammatical features correctly or appropriately were correlated with high intelligence. But when you get the students outside the classroom into more quote unquote genuine communicative situations, everyday naturally occurring conversation, there was no correlation found between intelligence and oral production in the language. So I think it's fascinating. So what are we actually studying? Are we studying language aptitude, or are we studying conformity to a classroom situation? And that super resonates with me, because I am a surprising no one as a kind of a professional student. I have high aptitude in the classroom, but I lack a lot of the confidence or, other motivating factors to get me to feel proficient in a language production situation. So in the Foreign Service, I've had to take many language tests to quote unquote like pass or what's the word, test out of needing language proficiency when we get to post. And so I've been I would excel in the classroom, and then when it came time to testing, which was a fully second language, I wouldn't be able to speak English at all, even when asking clarifying questions. Maybe the anxiety of it or the pressure made me just completely forget all the Spanish I had learned in the class. And so when I came back with my results, my teacher was like, "Oh my goodness, I'm so surprised you didn't get a higher grade." And I was like, frankly, me too, but I totally get it. This is par for the course with me. So yeah, anyway, this is just people have been really criticizing this idea of general intelligence that we see in kind of this old school IQ test, very rigid evaluation. So in response, Gardner actually came up with this idea of multiple intelligences. So you can see some examples on the right-hand side where you have visual spatial intelligence, linguistic verbal, interpersonal, intrapersonal. Are you an analytical and self-reflective person? Logical, mathematical, musical, body kinesthetic, or naturalistic. So somebody who is a more logical and mathematical intelligence might be better with grammar in a foreign language. But somebody who has a high interpersonal intelligence might be better at oral production. These are all fascinating ways to kind of like think about for yourself too. How do you interact? What are your best qualities, your best intelligences? So studies continue to look at these kind of multiple intelligences and look at different abilities that students have, and also preferences for the way that they learn. So learning styles, you can see this kinesthetic intelligence. So if you're a teacher of young students, you might have heard the total physical response method, or TPR method, which is kind of like getting kids up and moving and acting out something, or doing hand movements along with the song when they sing in a foreign language. And also, to be completely honest, as I'm seeing with my toddler, they do that with language acquisition for little ones too, for their first language. So, if you're rowing the boat, you physically row the boat. That's just an interesting example too. So this kind of like, body kinesthetic thing is fairly recent, and I think is really fascinating too, because it helps people get what's the word, like what's the word? I want to say imbue the information into their bodies, or absorb the information into their bodies through muscle memory, as opposed to just like pen on paper or words in brain. Related to this idea of intelligence is this concept of aptitude. So aptitude is, I don't know if any of you have ever had to take these aptitude tests, but I definitely remember filling out an aptitude test in high school, and then a guidance counselor would be like, you would be best suited for, and I can't remember, I'm sure it was something like teaching, or book novel writing. I don't know, something kind of like, you do you. Don't try and do this like math stuff. Just go and be a linguist. I'm fairly certain they said that. Because my aptitude for like linguistic logic, that side of my intelligence, has been pretty clear from a younger age. So aptitude is defined as the ability to learn quickly. So there are specific language aptitude tests that are used in things like the government and military to test people's ability to pick up on a language. And this can be broken down into different components. So things like language analysis, or breaking down the grammar of another language. Another thing could be phonemic coding. So this has the ability to understand the sounds that you hear and how they make up sound systems. So the English distinction, and the absence of that distinction in Japanese that we talked about a while back, and the ability to kind of go back and forth between how sounds create phonemes in a language. This is a specific type of language aptitude. The other thing that is really fascinating that I've experienced too is in my time in Pakistan, speaking Urdu, they have retroflex sounds and non-retroflex. So you have a da and a da. And so having people around, because I'm tuned to it as a linguist, I can hear those differentiations, and having people around me, Urdu speakers, and learners, I should say, Urdu learners, they couldn't necessarily hear the difference between that. So that was a fun thing that I was able to feel like, oh, okay, I've got this aptitude, I've got this ability to differentiate between these phonemic, between these different phonemes. Okay. Another thing is this idea of short-term memory, which is the ability to retain information and then quickly call it up again when you use it. So if you think about vocabulary, okay, so pretend you're in a foreign language classroom and you're given a list of 20 words at the beginning of a class, and then 40 minutes later, you have to use those words in a conversation. If you're one of those people who's just like able to remember words, you just have them and call them up when you need them. But if you're not, that would be a tough, a tough exercise for you, because you would have to be sitting there with your working memory and try and recall those 20 words that you learned at the beginning of class. So none of these, just to like hammer it in, because it's kind of like this correlation causation issue. So none of these are the one bullet of how you learn a second language, but it's all about your overall ability. And certain aptitudes are more comparable to certain types of instruction. Certain aptitudes are comparable to certain types of personality. And so yeah, this isn't just like one thing that you need to focus on. Okay. Related to what I was just mentioning with the different theories about different types of instruction, there are different, we do talk about different types of intelligences, and we talk about aptitudes. Sorry, let me repeat that. When we talk about different intelligences and different aptitudes, we are really talking about how do you benefit from different learning styles, or how can different learning styles take advantage of different intelligences. So one thing that's been operationalized by SLA researchers and developed into an approach to teach language is this idea of learning styles. So all right, so how well do we learn a second language has to do with our preferred way of absorbing and processing and retaining and remembering and recalling information in the second language. So you might think of somebody who is more of a visual learner, who needs like flashcards where there's a picture and a word on either side. Or if somebody is a little bit of a more reflective person, where they want to kind of watch a scenario or a skit take place, or somebody who's a more concrete person, where you need to feel movements related to the row your boat in another language. This is funny too, because I thought I was an auditory learner, but I think as I age, as I mature, my auditory processing is actually feeling like I'm not very skilled at that. So I remember, I was comparing, we were listening to Spanish podcasts in my Spanish training, and I just was like, I cannot retain this information. But the second I read it in a more when I read the transcript, I felt like I retained the information more, and I felt like I could kind of memorize the words, or like the shape of the words from the transcript, as opposed to like encoding them through auditory processing. Another really fun one that I've experienced firsthand is this phenomenon of this kinesthetic learning. So in linguistics, in linguistics early on, when we're talking about phonemes, just in general, you learned that the B sound, B as in boy, and P as in papa, the B and the P are the exact same manner of articulation and place of articulation. So manner is you have an abrupt stop of air, and then a gust of wind goes between your two lips. P, B. But the difference is your vocal folds vibrate on the B, and it does not vibrate on the P. So what's really cool in the way that we tested it to see if we could, visually and physically feel the difference. So the visual difference was you held a piece of paper up in front of your mouth. You guys can try this at home right now. And you say "buh," and the paper doesn't move. The paper does not flinch. But if you say "puh," the paper moves. The kinesthetic equivalent of that is you hold your hands on your throat in front of your voice box, in front of your voice box, and you say ba 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 ba, and you say ba, 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 ba. Your vocal folds vibrate on the ba, and they do not vibrate on the pa. So that is a very, very, very cool way to incorporate different sounds. So I, cut to a few years later, I was working in Egypt at a English language school, and these little kids were singing happy birthday to somebody, but they were saying happy birthday, because in Arabic, they don't have a p sound. So I, asked the teacher if I could try an experiment, and I had them all hold up a piece of paper in front of their mouths to make the b sound. And then I told them to make that same sound, but trying to move the piece of paper. And after a few trial and error and me instructing them badly, they all kind of figured it out that they needed to not vibrate their vocal folds, and they needed to put a gust of wind behind that sound. And lo and behold, a few hours later, we were able to get a happy birthday. So it was very, very cool. Very, very cool. And that's a fun little anecdote I have about utilizing various types of learning styles to accommodate different learners and all that fun stuff. That's enough digression. Oh, nope. I was about to change a slide. Sorry. So, okay, another distinction that this book talks about is this idea of field dependence. So if you're a field independent or a dependent learner, that depends on whether you like to receive new information in isolation, separate from the context, or if you like to have things presented to you in context so that you can make sense of the whole field when you're learning. So I think that's a really cool idea to think about. I'm not sure which one I am. Maybe I'm both. No, I think I might be field dependent. Anyway, it's fascinating. You can think about that yourself. Okay, so quickly, because I don't want to take too much time away from our discussion, but I think a really fun variable that people talk about too is personality. So people have investigated personality in terms of our ability to pick up another language through kind of the more interpersonal oral dimension of language learning and production. So basically, studies have looked at whether introverts or extroverts have the upper hand when it comes to picking up another language. Another one that's funny, and I'm sure that people have talked about this kind of anecdotally for you, and I'm definitely in the Foreign Service, people talk about this a lot, but inhibitions. So I remember somebody telling me that they would take a shot of alcohol before they would take their language aptitude tests to lessen their inhibitions. I think that sounds like a nightmare because I would just be like so stressed out. TBD on whether this is actually conclusive, but yeah, it's definitely been studied. Anxiety as related to that has been investigated too. We're hearing more and more about anxiety these days and variety of anxiety disorders that exist. And so it's really fascinating to think about whether somebody who has anxiety about speaking in front of a class or giving a presentation, are they as nervous when they're interacting with somebody in a foreign language in a more natural context? So in a service encounter at the grocery store, are you more comfortable than whether you are presenting in a more like quote unquote formal context? For me, I'm way more comfortable presenting in a formal context because I think a lot of the back and forth is gone. So I don't have to worry about what you're saying to me. I have to worry about what I'm saying. And then I just have to kind of like remember that in a more rote speech kind of way. And I have the ability to practice and practice and practice. Whereas if I see somebody, this was very clear when I was teaching in Argentina, I was teaching in Spanish. I felt very comfortable with the material in Spanish. And then when I would get questions, I'd be like, cool. I know kind of vaguely what these questions are going to be. But when I was in service encounters and I would go get groceries or something, and somebody said something in slang, or they said something in a rapid pace, or they, slurred their words, I was like, oh man, I feel completely lost. So, yeah, that's probably why and I've always been kind of like that, where it's like, oh, everyday things have a logistical anxiety that you can't account for. So this is the kind of fun part about being a teacher, is that you can practice your your material. Um, yeah. Oh, I just want to make sure I get to everything. So what's interesting too is that so the studies have talked about how anxiety, well, we all know that anxiety has kind of a negative stigma. Anxiety is more is pathologized because it is a diagnosis. But there is a pro to having a little bit of nervousness about speaking that puts pressure on and helps you perform in certain situations. Um, you know, the willingness to communicate, so you can see more ways about like, oh, I'm eager, I have a little bit of tension behind me, I have a little bit of anxiety, but I'm able to really hone and use that, like that focus that anxiety sometimes gives you to produce some um effective interactions. Mhm. These are all, so another thing that it's what's fascinating about this page too is that it's really hard to do quantitative studies on situations where it's self-reported. So if you say like, oh, tell me if you're an introvert, like I can't, my husband the other day, he was saying like, yeah, that's just the introvert side of me. And I was like, oh yeah, introvert is a total scale. Like if you had a really stressful day at work, you want to just go home and hunker and not have anyone talk to you and just recharge. There's no just one personality trait that every individual has all the time, every day. So if you're trying to give somebody a Likert scale, like on a scale of 1 to 5, how much of an extrovert are you? It's totally self-reporting and totally dependent on the situation. So I always get a little wary when I see like all extroverts do X, or this personality type does Y, or anxiety, it helps or hinders interaction in ABC method, because we're really just talking about qualitative analysis, right? Qualitative discourse analysis too. So, yeah, I think let's just leave it there. I don't want to keep hammering in the same information. Yes. Okay. So ideological approaches. So another area that we talk about with SLA is how people approach how people approach language learning based on their identity and belief about the language. So we can think about more macro social factors like relative power of languages in a specific society. So are you a speaker of a minority or minoritized language in a more colonial language environment? So like thinking of the Maori population, do you have a negative or positive approach to the English in that instance, the English that is spoken on a larger scale? Um, the other thing is, yeah, you can compare foreign language learners to the US versus people abroad. There are way more speakers of English as a second language or as an additional language in other parts of the world. And this obviously has to do with the global influence of English and its status as a world language in our current time. But there's also power and social factors. And so there's this idea of investment that was developed by Bonnie Norton Pierce, with idea of combination between somebody's motivation, their identity, and their status within the social order. And then the power relationship between the languages that they're acquiring. So I mentioned briefly about status and access to resources. I think this is a really fascinating reading, that you could look more into this idea of power and social factors and how that influences language acquisition. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the examples from the textbook about account for purposeful underperformance in a language, the Japanese student example, where they who spoke English but pretended to not speak English as well, so that they might potentially consciously or subconsciously hyperbolize their non-native accent or purposefully make incorrect grammatical errors. Basically, the notion there was that this person wasn't stepping out, so to speak, of their own identity as a Japanese person. So this adherence to the Japanese identity was actually I'm going to call it subconscious method of connecting back to their language, and then a hindrance in acquiring a second language. But that's, again, all speculation. So this is a really interesting question for discussion. The next slide here is about age. And again, I'm not going to talk too much more about this because I want to kind of pivot to the discussion. But I do want to talk about this idea of the critical period hypothesis that came up in the chapter. And this is the one that's grounded in the innatist theory of first language acquisition. So when we apply this idea, though, to second language acquisition, the idea is that after a certain age, the brain cannot access quote unquote universal grammar. That gives you the ability to pick up a language. So this kind of goes around with, I think we were talking about it in the discussion board, but this idea of brain plasticity and whether you are more or less rigid in the universal rules behind what language means for you. So I acquired English first. Well, actually, that's not true. I acquired English and Arabic at the same time, but then before the age of 7, I had left Cairo and we were back to the US. And so I was, very much solidifying my rules of English as being rules of language. And so when it comes time to learn another language, I'm always comparing it to those underlying rules that I have in my brain. I hope that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense, please let me know. I don't want to say too much more about it. I think that the book helped describe this a little bit more. This isn't to say, obviously, that older people cannot learn effectively. We just use different mechanisms as we age than the ones that we use when we're younger. So, Patricia Kuhl has this amazing video about the linguistic genius of babies. So she was showing the correlation between language scores on a test and the age of acquisition of the new language. And you can see here that the older you get, the lower the score is. But I do want to point out that she was illustrating in her studies this critical period hypothesis is specifically being able to distinguish between forms of a phoneme. And so she was doing the study on babies. So the processing of the language that was being spoken to the baby, processing of the language that was being spoken to the babies. So she talks about a critical period, very specific to phonological critical period, right? This does not tell us anything about a baby's ability to internalize rules of a grammar or understand pragmatic or discourse structures, or even things like cohesion in speaking or cohesion in texts. These are all things that we are very good at as we age. So phonological critical period is something that is way easier to test. And age is, well, unsurprising, right? Age correlates to a ton of other factors. So if you think about how your personality has changed as you aged, or whether you're more or less introverted as you change, or more or less confident. I'm sorry, not change, age. How age impacts the other factors that then impact your language ability is what I'm trying to say. So as I age, I am more confident in some respects and less confident in others. And so if you had given me an aptitude test, at age 10, 20, 30, it would have absolutely been different, right? So, okay, I think that's enough for age. Okay, great. So we are at our last slide. So Next week, we're going to be talking about language socialization. I think you'll find them really interesting because it's a little bit of a contrast to this week because they're a lot more qualitative, and we'll be getting away from this idea of correlating variables and language aptitude and all that stuff. Also, I want to remind you that your first reading response is due, so please start thinking about that and reviewing the guidelines. But I will post a video later on in the week with more information to talk you through the expectations and guidelines for that. Yeah, for that assignment. All right, everyone. Thank you so much and have an awesome week. Bye-bye.